Good afternoon to those of you that have joined us very promptly at 11 o'clock. We are scheduled to start our webinar at 11, and we have an hour planned with you today. We will give everyone a chance to quickly log in. We know that this does take a few minutes sometime, so we will give everybody else a chance to log in as well. And while we are waiting, I'll use the opportunity, maybe firstly to quickly introduce myself. I'm Jayendra Naidu. And I'm one of the directors at Lumenii and a senior organizational psychologist as well. So for those of you that attended our last webinar on succession planning, and we're looking forward to seeing Caitlin again. Sorry to have to disappoint you, but Caitlin is part of our team today, but she's handed the reins over to me to actually facilitate this discussion today. From the last time, you would notice also that we have undergone some changes. So previously, we were known as HFM Talent Index, but with all of the changes happening in the organization, very positive changes, I might add, we decided that it was time to rebrand and almost reinvent ourselves to reflect our unique South African origins. So therefore, we have decided to call ourselves Lumenii. Okay, for those of you wondering how to pronounce it, it's like it rhymes with you and I, Lumenii. We do have some very knowledgeable and very experienced guests with us this morning, and you are going to get a chance to see them a little bit later on. But perhaps while we're waiting, I'll just give everyone a chance to very quickly say hello, and I'll very briefly introduce them as well. So I'd like to start off maybe with Ravi. Ravi Reddy is the CEO of the South African National Blood Service, and we are very happy to have him with us today as well.
Good morning, everyone.
Thank you, Ravi. Then we also have Linda. Linda is from ooba, and she is the Group HR Executive at ooba. Linda Roos.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks, Linda. And then finally, we're also very privileged and very happy to have with us Ashni Muthuswamy. Ashni is the head of talent, transformation, and learning and development at Sun International. And Ashni has quite literally written the book on succession planning. So we definitely feel very privileged and very happy to have her with us this morning. Ashni?
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today.
Thank you to our panelists. So just a little bit of housekeeping while we're still waiting for people to get onto the call. Like I said, we will be chatting for about an hour. In that hour, we will share some information with you via a very brief PowerPoint presentation. Then we do have some time set aside to actually have a discussion with our panelists. Within the time, we will also include 2 polls. We'd like to get a sense of where you are in terms of succession planning. The polls do overlap with those that we ran last year, so we can actually compare results with last year. And we have received quite a number of questions from our audience members. We will try to address some of those in the conversation and discussion. We are unlikely to get to all of them, but we will try and make sure that we do send you a response to your question via email. The recording of this webinar and slides will also be made available to all of those that signed up for the webinar. You're very welcome to please participate. If you'd like to type a message to the panel, remember that the chat is at the bottom of your screen, and remember to select the option to type to all and not just to the host or the panelist. Okay, so we will be launching our first poll very soon. Okay, so you should be able to see the poll. So our first poll, we basically want to know from you, where is your organization on its succession planning journey? Okay, so tell us, choose one of those options and tell us where your organization is in terms of your succession journey. Okay, so we're going to give you a little bit of time to select your option there. Okay, so Caitlin and the team will shut down the poll shortly, and we should be seeing the results. Here we go. So 50% of you have indicated that you have a process in place, but we need to improve it. I think that's quite an encouraging number. So over half of the participants are saying we are engaged in succession planning. This is followed by 24% of people saying we do it reactively when the need arises. And very close to that, 22%, we don't do it, but we need to actually start. A small percentage of people are also saying we have a well-designed approach that supports our business strategy, and that's really great to hear. And obviously our aim is to increase that number so that most, if not all, South African organizations actually have a succession process to support their business strategy. Okay, and then a very small percentage, just 1% of people are saying we don't see the need for it currently. And that's not surprising. You know, sometimes organizations might feel either we're not big enough or we have other processes in place to mitigate risk. So we're not really seeing a need right now. So thank you very much for participating in our first poll. I am going to dive into our presentation. So we've titled this presentation and webinar Building Organizational Resilience via Succession Planning. And you might be asking why this focus on organizational resilience. And the reason is that over the past few years, we have been inundated with unprecedented challenges, not just in the business environment, but also as individuals in our personal capacity as well. And to name just a few of them, I don't even think that you need for me to name them. Things like the recent epidemic, impending new epidemic coming our way, the very tumultuous business context, economic environment, the natural disasters that we've experienced. So we have drought in Eastern Cape and we have floods in KZN, and the political environment has also been quite tumultuous over the recent past. For example, unrest. And even the war that's happening at the moment in the Northern Hemisphere is also impacting on us here in the Southern Hemisphere. So the question is, how do organizations actually ride the wave of all of this turmoil, challenge, and change, and actually survive them? So we notice that there's a large spectrum of responses. So all the way from organizations that don't just survive, but actually thrive through all of the struggle. And at the other end, unfortunately, we do get organizations that succumb to all of these challenges. And what is the difference between these organizations? That for us represents resilience. So resilient organizations are actually able to face and cope all of these unexpected challenges. A review of recent studies of organizations that are resilient shows us that we can identify about 4 different themes or components of organizational resilience. And those are, firstly, it's all about anticipating. So we understand that there will be challenges. So it's important for organizations to acknowledge that we will experience challenges in the future. We can't exactly predict what the challenges are going to be, and we acknowledge things do not remain the same, and we have to be prepared to actually meet those challenges and have some sort of plan in place so that we can deal with the challenges. And in having that plan, we know that we then can respond to those challenges. Now, responding means that we don't just have a static plan in place, but we are able to actually put that plan into practice and actually enact that plan. And when that plan is actually unfolding, we understand that the plan is also not going to be a static plan. We can't stick to the plan rigidly. Things are going to change and evolve, and we also need to evolve and adapt our response to change. So we see that this is very closely resembling what it means to be resilient as an individual. However, I believe that having a collection of resilient individuals is not necessarily going to make up a resilient organization. Yes, it probably is going to go a long way towards a resilient organization, but we also need to have a tool to achieve resilience at an organizational-wide level. And succession planning is just one of those tools that is going to help you achieve organizational resilience. And I think almost at 2 different levels. The one level being, how do you cope with that unexpected event where your critical talent, your scarce skills are leaving the organization? And secondly, by building a pipeline of resilient and agile individuals who are actually also contributing to overall organizational resilience. So I've mentioned the 9-grid matrix for the first time today. And I think 9-grid matrix is something that is quite synonymous with succession planning. And a lot of us, if not most of us, have probably heard of the 9-grid matrix before. It's been around a while. It's very well known, but unfortunately, in our experience, we find that it isn't necessarily well executed or well implemented. And while it's been around a while, it is our opinion that the 9-grid matrix is still a very valuable tool in succession planning. And I say this because the 9-grid matrix helps us to bring together two really important questions that we need to address in terms of succession planning and succession considerations. And those two questions are, firstly, are individuals performing well enough that we can start considering them for a successive role? And secondly, do they have the potential to actually fulfill that successive role? So the 9-grid matrix is a very neat tool that actually brings together potential for a successive role on the vertical axis and current performance on the horizontal axis. So by doing this, we can actually identify those individuals that are excelling currently and actually have the potential to take up a successive challenge and a successive role. Most organizations will probably want to maximize the top right-hand side of the 9-grid because this represents both their high potential and their high performance. And most organizations are looking to minimize the first column on the left-hand side and the bottom row, meaning that they want to minimize low potential and poor performance in the workplace. So the 9-grid matrix might sound quite straightforward, but we do know that it does come with lots of intricacies, and that is the reason that we chose to actually also focus on it again today and explore how we can actually implement the 9-grid matrix more successfully in succession planning. One of the challenges that organizations face very often when it comes to plotting potential and performance quantitatively is, what do we actually use as our metrics of potential and performance? Of the two, performance, I think, is slightly better known. It's slightly more familiar to us, and we're also a lot more comfortable talking about performance metrics. But potential, on the other hand, is not as well known, and organizations sometimes do struggle to actually quantify the metrics for potential. And in my experience, I've actually seen many weird and wonderful ways that organizations do come up with potential measurements. Okay? We believe that in trying to quantify potential, it is important to do so as objectively as possible, because objective measurement of potential is going to give you a good indication or good prediction of performance in the future. And on this slide, what we've done is we have just recapped and consolidated two well-known studies. The one of them is the longitudinal study by Schmidt and Hunter that looked at various criteria and how that correlated with performance in the workplace. And a more recent study is one by Demuse that looked at learning agility and how that correlated to performance in the workplace. If you look at all of those criteria, you will notice that some of those criteria are ones that we are quite familiar with and we utilize for selection decisions, for example, years of education, job experience, reference checks, etc. But if you look at the correlation, you'll notice that they actually aren't that great at predicting performance in the workplace. The correlation starts improving, the predictive quality starts improving when we start looking at more objective measures, such as personality, emotional intelligence, competency-based techniques, for example, interviews, competency potential for a role, etc. The best predictor being GMA, or general mental ability. So when we look at intelligence, cognitive ability, that's the best predictor of performance in the workplace. All of those criteria are really good at predicting performance in a role that is well defined. However, what happens when we can't really define a role that well, and when the role is going to evolve, the conditions are going to change? That is when learning agility really becomes important. Learning agility, by definition, is the ability to respond to new experiences and remain effective, or maintain a high level of performance. So you'll see that at its core, learning agility is about resilience, and it has the best correlation with leadership and performance in general. So by identifying high agile individuals, we can also build leadership agility and ultimately organizational agility and organizational resilience. A few points about potential before we move off the slide. The first one being that current performance does not equate with future potential. So we can't predict someone's performance by looking at their current performance. Secondly, potential is objectively measurable, like we've just demonstrated, and it definitely is not static. We can look at potential for a well-defined role or potential to cope with change in future. And the third point being that agility is a very clear measurement of both resilience and the ability to deal with change. So that was potential on the vertical axis. The horizontal axis concerns measuring performance. And like I said, this is something that we're more familiar with. We often engage in discussions about whether to talk about objective measurements or subjective measurements of performance. And both, I think, do have their place in the workplace because we're talking about human beings. So that element of subjectivity will creep into it. There's a number of different measurements of performance that we are familiar with. For example, KPIs, supervisor ratings, performance measurement tools such as balanced scorecard. And something else that I'd like to introduce and maybe even get you to start thinking about is the inclusion of 360 feedback as well as a measure of performance. The difference for me is that performance measurement or performance management techniques looks at hard skills, technical skills, accomplishment of KPIs, whereas the 360 feedback also tells us to what extent is the individual actually displaying the necessary behaviors that contribute to the accomplishment of those KPIs and the goals that are set. 360 feedback also enables us to gather information about an individual's demonstrated agility in the workplace. So if we populated our 9-grid matrix, we have some nice objective data about our talent pool. However, it is not the be-all and end-all of succession planning. It is merely the beginning of succession planning. Okay, and your 9-grid matrix forms a very nice foundation for a comprehensive, holistic succession process or succession management in the workplace. We need to supplement this with other information. For example, we're talking about human beings. So we need to ask questions around what is this person's interest in a successor position? What are their career aspirations? What are their development aspirations and so on? What are line managers' expectations? What do they want and how do they see the role evolving? So it is important to include all of the stakeholders that are involved in the succession process. While succession planning might be owned by the organization, we need to acknowledge and include all of the stakeholders that contribute towards it, one of them being the potential successor. So we do need to find a way to include successor input. We need to find a way to be able to share information with successors in the most appropriate and valuable way as well. For me, one of the best advantages of including a qualitative element to your succession planning process is that it results in a succession management process that gives you actionable next steps. So we can comment on what is the person's readiness for the next level. What are the next steps that we need to take to ensure that the person is actually ready to take up the reins in the next role as well. We can reflect on our current management processes as well, our job descriptions, our role descriptions, our performance management, and see to what extent those are actually contributing towards succession. Okay, so I did promise that it was going to be a very brief presentation. We will share this presentation with you. So if you do have questions, remember to type that into the chat so that we can pose those to the panel. So now I am sure that you didn't come here just to listen to me speaking. We do have a very illustrious and well-experienced panel that we have put together for you today. So what I'd like to do is actually move on and give our panel an opportunity to actually also answer some questions. I'd like to kick off with a question for all of our panel members and just to tie in resilience once again to our discussion. So if I could ask our panel members to please reflect on what does it mean for an organization to be resilient, and how does succession planning actually relate to this? Okay, so what does it mean to have a resilient organization, and how does succession planning actually relate to this? I'm going to invite all of our panel members to please reflect and respond on this. And unfortunately, I do have to choose one person to put on the spot first. So I'm going to start with Ravi once again. Ravi, could you maybe give us your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Jayendran. I should have listened a bit more carefully to your first few slides and I've got the model answer. But I think we must be adaptable to a changing environment, and we must be prepared to respond quickly. Certainly in Sanbus, our internal environment and core value chains, such as our systems, processes, people, have to be integrated to ensure sustainability. And in the environment that we operate, which is a very difficult environment, where we rely on blood donors, any small change externally can lead to pressure to deliver on our mission. And certainly in this regard, having the right people and culture to deliver is critical. And I think to your second question, certainly talent management and succession planning is a key element in building strong teams, and certainly promoting from within, retaining knowledge, knowledge, and building long-term stakeholder relationships to leverage from times of difficulty is absolutely critical. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ravi. You touched on some very important themes such as integration, sustainability, inclusion, and so on. Let's hear from our other panel members. If I could maybe ask Linda, if you could share your thoughts with us.
Sure, Jayendran. So for me, a resilient organization is one that can not only bounce back from setbacks or from adversaries, but certainly can bounce forward. And for me, a resilient organization is also one with very high social capital. So if you've got those two things in place and you can marry them with a really good succession program or succession strategy, I think there's no such thing as certainty, but it does give you a greater level of certainty that your organization is going to be resilient in the face of adversity in the future. So for me, being able to bounce forward and having very high social capital married with a really strong succession strategy.
Thank you very much. I like that, bounce forward. Okay. Let's hear from Ashni as well. Ashni, your thoughts, please.
So I'm just going to use a case in point. So I work for the hospitality industry and gaming industry. So I think post-COVID and during the pandemic, our operations was actually shut down. Some business units were closed up till 6 months. And we had gone through a very traumatic year, 2 years actually, in terms of how it impacted our business, our revenue, etc. And I think one of the saving graces was the work that we had done prior to COVID hitting. And a lot has been done in the talent management, the succession management space, actually building processes, ensuring that people understood that they have a career in the organization. And I think that has helped a lot in terms of retention of people during our crisis. We had still a very high retention rate, irrespective that salaries were slashed. People chose to stay. And one of the reasons they chose to stay is because we had very nicely, consistently worked on our culture in terms of ensuring people felt that they had a career in the organization. There was a sense of certainty. It helped us mitigate against business continuity risk because we knew we have been doing talent reviews. We understood who our top talent was. We could actually leverage off our talent bench strength and deploy people at times of crisis in the right positions to actually mitigate the risks that we were going through. So yeah, definitely, I think it does help.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Ashni. A really nice example of how transparency of the succession process is really important to get buy-in from all the stakeholders and build the resilience of the organization. Okay. So I think that I was neglectful. We do have a second poll, which I'm going to ask the team to please pop up for us. Okay, so we've done with the first poll. So our second poll also, you'll notice that there is an overlap with one that we ran last year because we do want to compare the results. This poll is basically asking, what barriers to succession planning do you experience in your organization? We've given you a few options. Please select a few options. Okay, so once again, we're going to give you some time to quickly respond to that poll. And while we are giving you time for that, I'll maybe just keep the panelists updated in terms of our next question. And I see our results already in, so that was really quick. Okay, so the biggest barrier to successful succession planning is a defined process, or rather the lack of a defined process. Okay, so 51% of people saying that is what is a barrier to succession planning. And this is followed by 1/3 of people saying buy-in. Okay, so very interesting. So not getting the buy-in from the various stakeholders. Okay, only 31% are saying that budget is an issue in terms of succession planning. 32% are saying knowledge of how to actually do it is a barrier, and very closely followed by time being an issue, 29%. And very, very few people are saying actually, well, there's nothing standing in our way of actually implementing succession planning. Okay, thank you very much. We will make the results of those polls available as well. Okay, so our next question, and this one actually, I think I'm going to direct to you, Linda. Succession is most impactful when it has the buy-in of top leadership. In your organization, how have you made a business case for a succession plan or process?
So I remember a conversation with our CEO probably about 3 years ago, said, Reese, we have to start focusing on succession planning. And I said, do we need succession planning? And his response was kind of, do we? And so I knew that it was going to be a bit of an uphill battle with him in terms of obviously getting executive sponsorship. And then we arrived at a situation not too long ago where we had to, an internal employee or employee that wanted to make an internal move needed to be replaced in the organization. And this person had been with the organization for almost 20 years, had developed a very, very niche role in the organization. And the prospect of finding a replacement, we knew would be difficult, but we didn't think it would be impossible. And it turned out to be such that because the role is incredibly niche, it's not something you can train for. So there isn't really a talent pipeline for it. It's stressful. It was so incredibly scarce that we actually couldn't fill the role. And it created panic for us because it's a role that has a significant role to play in our commission and payments division. And the cost of mistakes is very costly for the business. The ramifications are very costly. And fortunately, the person ended up staying in their role, but it made us really wake up to the fact that we have got to build a talent pipeline because we have many of those types of roles in our organization. And then a recent risk assessment of the business has actually identified succession planning as one of our top 3 risks. So the data was there. It was indisputable that we absolutely had to start looking at this, and we now have.
Okay, so it sounds like you were able to use that impending talent risk to actually make a business case, okay, and then get the buy-in of the top leaders. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Ashni, as I've stated earlier, you've actually written a book on succession, and part of the title is about the do's and don'ts of succession planning. Could you please share with us what are your top do's and your top don'ts when starting with a succession process? I know I'm asking a little bit of a difficult question, but I think there's definitely going to be lots of audience members that have that on their mind. So what are the definite do's and definite don'ts, if you could name a few of them?
So I think firstly, understand why you're doing succession management. What is the purpose? What is the benefits for your organization? Because you have to build a business case in order to get leadership buy-in. And it's not HR speak where you say, you know, everyone else is doing it, so we should do it. It's about how is it ultimately going to impact on your business revenue? How is it going to mitigate business risks? What's going to happen? I think Linda just mentioned, you know, there are certain key scarce skills, very difficult to actually develop. And if you're not actually proactive in developing these skills, it has a huge negative impact on your business. So I think getting leadership buy-in is very key. Creating a common language when you start with succession. What is succession? What are some of the key terms that everyone should know about? How do you define high potential in your particular context? Understanding what is your philosophy on talent management. There's different philosophies. You should embrace the one that works for you in terms of your organization. Have a very clearly simple process. Don't ever over-engineer, cut and paste something that looks very best practice, but doesn't make sense for your particular industry, your particular business. I think also what's very key is understanding your context. You have your organizational context, and then we have things such as transformation. We know now with employment equity, there's new sectoral targets. How does that impact in terms of future leadership in your organization? I think the other key thing for me is don't just think that succession management is the key bullet. You have to have other supporting HR processes such as retention, engagement strategies, career management, and so on. Those are my do's. My don't is do not create expectations. And what I've seen over and over again, you tell a person they're a success and suddenly they have an inflated ego, they walk around that they're entitled, and it causes chaos with your culture. You know, it really messes up processes in your organization. People become demoralized, etc. It's about ensuring that you do not create expectations, do not create an entitlement culture, do not over-engineer succession, make it very simple in terms of buy-in. Do not focus on replacement of people, focus on replacing positions. Positions always occur in a context. And the other key thing is business changes. We've seen with the pandemic, some businesses have totally closed. Sometimes person who you are actually nurturing as a successor might not be relevant in 10 years or 2 years, etc., because the job may no longer exist in 2 years. It might be a redundant role. So I think those are my don'ts, the clear don'ts.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone that wanted those were making some notes of the do's and the don'ts. So what we hear in that as well is that, you know, it's important to take people along with you. But Ravi, if I could maybe ask you to reflect on what value does succession planning add, not just to the organization, but to its people as well?
Yeah, I think succession planning certainly for the people, it gives you the opportunity to be part of the system. You know, staff are valued and given opportunities for promotions, particularly internal promotions, and improving your skills can lead to overall performance improvement, better results, and organizational effectiveness. Employees are probably given the space to develop themselves, and it certainly in SANBIS contributes to the overall employment value proposition. And it also demonstrates that we do care about our individuals. And I think, you know, in the SANBIS case, when one looks at the retention that we have of employees, long-serving employees, and the amount of promotions within, you know, I think that's a living testimony of the value that it is adding in our organization. Thanks.
Thank you, Ravi. I think I can also reflect on that. You know, having been lucky to be involved in the process at SANBIS, we have seen such an incredible reaction from management and individuals. We have managers actually calling us asking, you know, when is my turn? When am I going to go through this process? We have managers calling us to say, this is great. I've actually been able to use this to guide my career conversations with my subordinates. So, and that is one of the ways, Ashni, that they've actually dealt with not creating unrealistic expectations, because now there's an understanding. Organization will always have a succession plan, but it's your responsibility to also have a career plan. And hopefully those two things overlap and coincide as well. Linda, from your side, what value do you see it, or have you seen it adding to the organization and its people?
So we're really only at the starting point of our process. And already, I think the value that we've seen has been in the fact that we now have a clear framework. We've got executive sponsorship. We have a clear way forward in terms of how we're going to do it. We've begun to talk about it at leadership levels. So there's a plan in place. The value for us has been in knowing that we have a risk, but we are able to deal with it. We're able to mitigate it. And I think that the value down the line is certainly going to be around people feeling that they have career growth opportunities in a very traditionally flat structure. That people will be able to express, their desires for their career, and that we'll have the right kinds of people in place when we need to. Certainly, like the role that I spoke of, that would have been a calamity for our business. So there's value in knowing that we can prevent that from happening in future.
Thank you very much. So I am aware that we are about 10 minutes to the end of our webinar, but also there are lots of questions coming in from our audience. We will definitely try and address some of those. But before we get there, just one last question, which Ashley, I'll ask you please to reflect on first. So effective succession planning is about more than just implementation. So what elements are needed to ensure that it is supported and maintained in the organization?
So I think what's very important is once you have identified successes, that's like just a small part of the bigger success of the project. The bigger thing is actually trying to transition those individuals into those vacant roles you've identified for them. And so many things can go wrong during that process. Life happens, we've seen with COVID, people have reprioritized what they want out of their careers. People have now chosen to emigrate. Some people who would have been mobile previously are no longer mobile. So in essence, you have to engage with those successes on an ongoing basis. You have to understand what is their life challenges, what is no longer possible. Are they still interested in being a successor? We have to look at what are their developmental challenges. It's important once you have successes that you have individualized development plans in place for them. You have to ensure that there's proper coaching, mentorship, that they get the necessary exposure through job shadowing, rotation, whatever that may be, so that they are mature and they're able to deal with any leadership challenges that have been thrown to them. So I think for me, the key thing is about, in terms of maintenance, is ensuring that it's a continuous process. It's not an event. You have a succession management or talent review process once a year, you close the files, and next year we'll see you guys again. It's all about checking what has changed. Are people ready? What still needs to happen? Is there other things you need to do as an organization from an engagement and a retention perspective that you need to work on? And these strategies have to be in place, because once you have people that are top talent, your competitors are very likely to poach those individuals. So you need to define what are those high values these people have and hold, that you can actually nurture them and ensure that these opportunities you're offering them actually reflect some of those values.
Thank you very much, Ashley. I'm actually very curious to hear about some success stories, and I'm sure that our audience is as well. So I'm going to leave this open to all of our panel members. Could you perhaps share some examples of how succession has mitigated the talent risk in your business?
So I'll talk. So previously, I think 4 years ago, our previous CEO, he had been in the position a few years and he was ready now to move on to something else. And for us, it was such an easy transition because the CFO, we had been actually developing from a succession perspective. And he had all the necessary information. He was involved in all the key projects, mergers, acquisitions, etc. So there was a very nice, easy transition when the CEO left. We already knew who was going to be the next CEO. And for his successor as well, it was a very nice, easy transition to identify his successor for the future CFO role. And I think for us, we've seen various examples. And as recent as a month ago, one of our general managers from the business units, the position became vacant and we already had someone as a successor for that role. And it wasn't challenged because everyone knew he was going to be a successor. The person had proved himself in various projects he was given, etc. So there, again, there was a natural progression into a vacant role.
Great, thank you very much. Ravi, I wonder whether you could reflect on this. Have you seen how succession has mitigated a possible talent risk in your organization?
Yes, I could give you many, many examples. I think the best is to start with myself. You know, I started in Sandbus as a technician and progressed through various roles. But just to talk about the last role, I was chief operations officer, and part of the succession planning process, as you and your team would know, was, you know, we went through the whole man-grid matrix, and I was identified as a potential successor. When our previous CEO left about 2 years ago, just under 2 years ago, you know, I was given the opportunity to become the CEO. But more recently, a year and a half ago, medical director left, and we'd been very busy with succession planning. So we were very quickly able to employ a candidate from internally as the medical director. And the medical director position in an organization like Sandbus, you know, is again, as Linda said, you need a certain set of skills. It's very difficult to employ someone from outside to fill the position immediately. There's a lot of training, understanding of regulations pertaining to blood transfusion, etc. So that talent pipeline has been built. And what is more, you know, well, what is great for us is when we fill those positions, we also had in the pipeline, in medical, in operations, etc., that people from within could fill my previous role and the medical director's previous role. But right across the organization, I've only talked at executive level, but when you look at managerial levels at zones, I'll never forget a case in Polokwane where we had informal talent management succession planning, where this individual who walked in a very remote area was given the opportunity to come into meetings and chair meetings, etc. And an opportunity arose for a more middle manager position. She applied for it and got it. And one of the key things was I was a succession planning success that she wrote to thank people. So yeah, there's a number of stories, but I'll stop there. Thanks.
Wow, really great to hear so many good news stories. Thank you very much, Ravi. Linda has indicated to us that she does need to slip off the call in a short while because she has other commitments. But Linda, before we let you go, you have indicated that you're still in the process of planning your whole succession process. But could you maybe reflect on why you've chosen to include agility as part of your succession planning and succession management, and what the role it actually plays for you?
So we've got a number of criteria that we'll be using to determine readiness for succession. And so we've got our KPIs, we've got our 360s, we'll be using management potential and a number of other things. Learning agility is one of them. And actually, if I had to pick only one, that would be the one. Learning agility for me is absolutely essential in determining the right successor for a role. You have to have somebody who is capable of developing new effective behavior in the face of change. So as I said, for me, if there's nothing else that I assess you on, it would definitely be learning agility, because the rest I think we can work on. So it's less about the potential that you have now in terms of the competencies you have now, but rather about the competencies you're going to be able to cultivate as the business changes.
Oh, thank you very much, Linda. Linda, we'll understand if you need to quietly slip away in a few minutes, but we're lucky enough to have you with us for a little while longer. So we do actually have some time left over for audience questions, which we will actually try and address now. And as I said, we aren't necessarily going to get to all of the questions that we received. We received quite a few questions, but we will definitely try and get to some of them. Okay, so the first question that we have from the audience is, should we inform staff that they are being considered for succession, or would that create false expectations or inevitable discontentment? So this is something that has crept up. Ashni did speak about it very briefly. And maybe I can reflect on it a little bit as well. So for me, I think you're going to create false expectations and discontentment if you sort of put the cart before the horse and identify individuals rather than identifying a process to mitigate a talent risk. So I think if it is well known in the organization that we are always going to be engaging in succession planning, it's part of our organizational continuity strategy. We will always have this plan in place, but we will also engage with you in terms of your career aspirations and your career planning. And we will try and see if those two things actually coincide and overlap. And if they do, then that's great. Something else that I've also noticed with some clients is that they tend to identify maybe one or two individuals as a successor for a particular role. But as Ashni has also commented, we're not replacing a person, we're replacing a role. So for me, identifying just one or two individuals is not necessarily mitigating the risk, because you still stand the risk of that one or two individuals also leaving the organization. So I think everyone that's in the organization needs to be included in some sort of plan, whether it's a lateral move or a progressive move or just development in your current role. But can I ask maybe our panel members to also reflect on this? How do you prevent those expectations and the inevitable discontentment whilst keeping people informed?
So one of the possible ways you could do it is you have a talent pool. So you don't have individual successes identified, you have a pool of people, and you do communicate to that pool of people that they're a group of people in a succession talent pool, and should a vacancy arise, they are just as equal in terms of competing for that role. So it's not one heir apparent where that person's definitely getting it. It's just about getting a ticket to the game. They still have to participate in terms of who is the best individual when that vacancy arises. Yeah.
So now we know why you've written the book. I could not have said it any better than that. Thank you so much, Ashni. Linda, Ravi, do you want to reflect on that? How do you prevent expectations being created when you're communicating succession?
I think both of you have covered it. It's the process, it's ensuring transparency and honesty in the process, and giving people the opportunity to study and progress, but exactly that there's no anointed successor, and create a larger pool.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay, I'll move on to our next question. It's actually a follow-up from the previous question. How do you know that successors are willing to move into succession roles without creating any expectations? So how do you know that they're willing without creating that expectation we just spoke about?
I'll give that an attempt. So what we do at Sandus as part of the process is, we go through the 360 process, the 9-grid matrix, as you've looked at it. And when we're looking at senior management, for example, the executives sit and we look at across all the senior managers that potentially, have succession roles. But the important thing is to also have the conversation with the individual. Someone might be really a specialist and just is very happy in that job. And, they're willing to mentor, etc. So I think the key thing is to have the very serious conversations with the individuals to identify, whether they're willing to take on more responsibilities, etc.
And I think the important thing is that these processes don't stand alone. Ravi, you mentioned a 360 process. So following a 360 process, the obvious result of that is to provide feedback, have a discussion with the individual about their strengths, the possible areas of limitation. And I think incorporated into that also a bit of a performance discussion and a career discussion. So these processes, I think, need to run concurrently, and they do need to be regular. So if you're having regular career conversations with your talent pool, then you already know where the aspirations lie and whether they are or not willing to move into another role. Linda, any last thoughts from you before you need to leave us?
No, I just answered a question on the chat around advertising the role. So see, multiple people have said, but if I have a successor in place or succession pool, do I still have to advertise the role to the wider business? And that is a gray area, unless you can create clarity through your policies. So something I always maintain and feel very strongly about is don't advertise a role to the whole business that you've already got 2 or 3 people in mind for. Rather create space in your policy to give clarity to people that this is a role that is in our succession strategy, and that it'll be opened up to the people, or to the pool of talent that have been developed. So you can do whatever you like, depending on the extent to which your policies make it clear.
I think there's probably also policies in place at both SANBIS and Sun International. Ashley, Ravi, would you like to maybe comment on that balance that you need to actually get in place?
So I support what Linda just said. I think it's important that you have your internal processes mapped out. And that's why I said, before you even go on the succession journey, internally, you need to be very clear about what does it mean if you have successes, if there's vacancies that arise, what is the process that you're going to follow. And one of the key things we do in Sun International is we have something called a talent mobility process. So for senior roles, it's a policy that we've signed off to say, if there are senior roles, we will first look at our talent pools and we will use that as our first search mechanism. If we aren't successful, there are people not ready now, then we open it up from a recruitment perspective. But because the policy is widely communicated, it's not a surprise when these senior roles actually get filled with people from a succession pool.
Yeah, thank you. So once again, that theme of transparency coming up. And if you have it in the policy does need to be communicated with everyone. Thank you very much, Ashley. Ravi, do you want to reflect on that?
No, I agree with that. Everything's been said. And I think this is an area of, I wouldn't put it concern, but it's something that we worry about, because the policies have to be very clear that if you've got, a small group, rather that the policies are clear that you go and attract from or recruit from that group and select from that group. If the policies are not clear, it's going to cause problems. And at SANBIS, we still, that's one area that I think we do need to work on, to make it quite clear, because there will be criticism if, you ring fence jobs without your policies being quite clear on that. And that is an area we do need to work on. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And we know that nothing is cast in stone, and the policy probably also can evolve as the organization, the times evolve. We have about 5 minutes left for audience questions. There's one last question that I think is related to what we've just been discussing. So I'll quickly try and include that one as well. What do we do when we have core roles and key talent in which we don't have successors? Do we build successes internally, or do we look externally? So when you don't have talent internally, what do we do? Do we build the capacity internally, or do we automatically look externally?
I think if you're 100% clear that you don't have talent internally, and then I would challenge you to be really clear about that with objective data, then obviously you would need to look externally. But if you do, there's a talent marketplace in every organization. And I think if you really tap into that, there may be people who are 3 or 5 years away from that, but that do have the potential to fill that role later on. And it's definitely worth beginning with their development, even if you know that it's going to be a long time before they're ready for the role. It's definitely worth beginning with their development, because as was the case with us, there aren't people outside. Where there is, it's a lot easier, obviously, but where there aren't people outside, where there's less than 5 of them in the country, for example, you will have to find a way to develop them internally.
And I suspect that at SANBIS, you're in pretty much a similar situation, Ravi, with your very unique roles.
Yes, we are. And, I've challenged our HR team on the 70-30 rule, particularly at middle to senior management executive, 70% of promotions from within, and, and trying to expand that, but also bringing in people from external, new thinking, etc. And no matter how much, you do with succession planning and talent management, there will be occasions when someone decides that they're going to up and leave, a CFO or someone, where you just don't have someone who's ready, and you might have to go outside in those instances. So we do plan, and some people might be in the 3 to 5 year or the 2 to 3 year group, and but we might have instances where we just don't have people at that time internally, where we might be forced to go external. But ideally, you would want to continue to try and build talent for key positions, particularly where there's, a lot of institutional memory in those areas. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. So I think we have time to squeeze in one last question. And I think it's a fairly short answer to this question. Are there online assessments one can use to assess agility? Okay, the short answer is yes, absolutely. There are online assessments that you can use for agility. But I think while speaking about that, also comment on the fact that there are also online assessments that you can use to get a quantitative measure of potential, of performance, and potential from various perspectives as well. Okay, so very quick and short answer to that. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left, and in the last 5 minutes, I think I'm going to give the panel a chance to maybe share their final thoughts with the audience. If there's maybe one tip that you can share with everyone, one last critical thought that you want to share, please do so right now. Linda, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first quickly because I have to go. But yeah, I think if you know, a lot of people from the poll still, it's a case of we don't have a defined framework. We don't know how. I was there not very long ago, actually. There are a great deal of, or great many people that are able to assist you. We are working with Lumenii. But before that, you know, I had to start with, I remember when my sister and I were on a farm and we got horses. We sat one day when the first horse arrived and said, typed on Google, what do horses eat? And I think, you know, start there, and that's okay if you have to start at how to do succession planning. But it is something that you should start, and even if it's at a very basic level. So yeah, and thanks everybody, it was great.
Thank you very much for joining us, Linda, and thank you for sharing that very practical piece of advice. I'd like to invite our other two panel members. If there's one last piece of practical advice you could share, what would that be?
So from my side, I think don't be afraid of succession. And a lot of people have stayed away from it because they think about the legal consequences of wrongful appointments, and they have heavily involved unions, and you know they're going to be taken to the CCMA, and they see the worst case scenario, and they try and just do very little to show that they have a succession plan without going into a lot of detail. I think don't be afraid of it, you know, and build on it year on year. You don't come up with a complicated process. Do something simple that you can replicate, because succession, all about succession is the consistency in which you actually implement it. So do something simple. Don't try and compete with your competitors. Do something that works for your organization and makes business sense to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ravi, is there one last piece of practical advice you can share with us?
At the time, the colleagues in the panel, you know, you must just get on and do it. And, you know, if you start basic, small, I think if you try to build policies and procedures and bureaucracy, it's going to be an exercise where you tick the boxes and you keep the books and the 9-grid matrix until the next year, because you've got to report to the board. It has to be a living process. And even if you do it informally, you know, at first in some areas, and I remember simply inviting the different levels of management to senior management meetings just to get exposure and building on that. So it's really to just do it. But the most critical thing is the buy-in of the leadership teams, and you know, and be willing to mentor people and you know, just leading by example. That is crucial.
What I like about that, Ravi, is that you're not just talking about, you know, the planning itself, but you're also talking about actually doing something to get people to the next level. Thank you very much for that, Ravi. So from my side, if I could share with you one piece of practical advice, it's that don't think about succession planning as a process by itself. It needs to be incorporated and integrated with all of your other talent management processes like recruitment, development, performance management, to name just a few of them. So that's my last pearl of wisdom that I'm going to share with you today. So thank you very much to our very learned and experienced panel members. Linda unfortunately had to leave us. Thank you very much, Linda. Ashley, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us, giving us those wonderful examples. I'm sure you've inspired lots of people to actually try and tackle this that might have seemed insurmountable to them. Ravi, thank you so much for sharing a perspective from a leader of the organization and of a very complex and unique organization as well. We definitely learned a lot from your experiences and your anecdotal evidence that you shared with us as well. Thank you so much to all of our audience members. Thank you for the questions that you have submitted. So just to reiterate, we didn't answer all of the questions, but we definitely will get a response to you via email. We will also make the recording available to everyone, as well as the slides that we did share. And if there's still something that you feel you want to engage us on that we didn't have enough time to discuss, we're very happy to schedule some time with any of you. So thank you, everyone, and have a lovely rest of the day. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.